Hey there. Before we dive into this wild story, if you're into tales where history gets seriously weird, where one stupid moment can change laws for centuries, do me a solid and hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And let me know down in the comments where you're watching from. It's always crazy to see this community stretching across the globe. Now let's get into it. Picture the world not as a map of countries, but as a vast, dimly lit forest. Clearings in that forest are towns, lit by hearthfire and fear. This is the early Middle Ages. The Roman roads are crumbling. The old gods are whispering from the trees, and the new god from the church is trying to shout them down. In this world, order is a fragile thing, a thin crust over a seething pot of chaos. And the guys in charge of keeping that crust intact? The medieval bureaucrat. Don't let the fancy title fool you. This wasn't some pencil pusher. This was a monk, a clerk, a local bailiff. A man whose power came from a quill and a relentless, terrifying belief that everything, and I mean everything, had to make sense in God's plan. He was the most dangerous creature alive, because he couldn't handle randomness. A bad harvest? Someone sinned. A plague? Moral decay. A pig eating a child? Well, that wasn't just a farm accident. That was a breach in the moral universe. And that breach had to be tried, judged, and sealed by law. Our story really starts with that pig. The year is 1386, in the French town of Falaise. But to understand why what happens next isn't just silly, we have to feel that town. It smells of wood smoke, manure, and baking bread. The houses lean into each other like tired old men. Everyone knows everyone, and everyone knows their place. Under God, under the Lord, under the watchful eyes of their neighbors. The law here isn't just rules. It's the rhythm of life, the pattern that keeps the wolves, both literal and spiritual, outside the gate. So one morning, when a scream slices through the misty air, it's not just a tragedy. It's an alarm. A child is dead, mauled in the street, and the culprit is found, snuffling in the gutter, covered in filth and blood. A sow. A big, dirty, completely ordinary farm animal. Today, we'd call it a horrific accident. We'd put the animal down, mourn the child, and maybe build a better fence. But in Falaise in 1386, the animal wasn't just a hazard. It was an agent, an actor. In a world where Satan could tempt and God could intervene, where every wolf might be a werewolf and every strange woman a witch, why couldn't a pig be a murderer? The universe had rules. The pig broke them. Therefore, the pig had to be seen to break them formally, publicly, legally. The town didn't just kill the sow. They arrested her. They threw her in a human jail. They gave her a human trial. Imagine the scene in that cramped courtroom. The air thick with the smell of unwashed wool and nervous sweat. Serious men in robes sat at a bench, trying to ignore the fact that the defendant was squealing and rooting at the floorboards. She was formally charged with murder with malice aforethought. They assigned her a lawyer. Can you imagine that guy's day? Having to stand up and construct a defense for a pig. Your honors, my client was overcome by base animal instinct, not moral failing. The pig, of course, said nothing in her own defense. She probably pooped on the floor. But the trial wasn't about the pig's testimony. It was about the town's sanity. By putting the pig on trial, they were reaffirming that their world had logic. That justice was blind even to species. The judge listened to the arguments, nodded gravely, and pronounced the sow guilty. The sentence: public hanging. And not just any hanging. They dressed the pig in a man's shirt and breeches before they strung her up. They humanized her to execute her. The crowd gathered, not in horror, but in grim satisfaction. Order was restored. The beast that acted like a man was punished like a man. The cosmic balance was corrected with rope and ceremony. The story, though, it didn't end at the gallows. See, news of the Falaise pig trial spread, and other towns, facing their own chaotic animal incidents, thought, hey, that's a system. But the church, always keen on managing the franchise of divine judgment, got nervous. People were executing God's creatures without the proper spiritual paperwork. So a bishop stepped in. A new law was decreed. No animal could be formally tried or executed without ecclesiastical authorization. Even a pig needed a thumbs up from God's middle management. This was our first law born from one insane incident. And it set a precedent that echoed through the centuries. Because once you've put a pig on trial, where do you stop? Soon, the court dockets of Europe were stuffed with the animal kingdom. A rooster in Basel was accused of laying an egg, a clear sign of witchcraft, and was burned at the stake alongside its cursed offspring. Locusts were excommunicated in France. Weevils were put on trial in church courts for destroying crops. A village in Switzerland once prosecuted a herd of cows for trespassing. They were found guilty and exiled. This wasn't just legal slapstick. This was a worldview. If everything is part of God's creation, then everything is part of God's moral order. A sinful cow was as much a problem as a sinful baker. The law was the tool to scour that sin away, to prove that man was in charge, even if the defendant had hooves. This mindset, this desperate need to legislate against chaos, bled into everything. It affected knights, those paragons of supposed chivalry. Take the case in 14th century Bohemia. Tournaments were the NFL of their day, violent, glamorous, and deeply repetitive. So one nobleman, probably deep into his cups, decided to spice things up. He didn't arrive with a new squire or a fancy helmet. He arrived with a goose, not for eating, not as a mascot, as a participant. He'd had a tiny suit of plate armor forged for the bird, complete with a little helm. He named it Sir Hiss of the Pond. He declared it his squire. First, it was hilarious. A knight parading around the tilt yard with a clanking, confused goose waddling behind him. But chaos, like a bad cold, always finds a way in. During the joust, Sir Hiss panicked. He escaped. A flapping, feathered cannonball of polished steel shot across the field. A real squire made a grab for him, got bitten, and the goose, in its armored terror, plowed straight into the legs of a warhorse. The horse, understandably, lost its mind. It threw its rider, crashed into other knights, and by the time the dust settled, 3 men were seriously injured and Sir Hiss was deceased. A noble joke had turned into a battlefield casualty report. The authorities didn't laugh it off. They legislated. A decree was issued across the region. No dressing, arming, or mounting of animals in imitation of noble combatants. The law specifically mentioned beasts of burden, fowl, and domestic pets. In plain English, don't give your chicken a sword. One night's stupid gag, born from boredom and too much ale, created a law that would confuse historians for centuries. People would find it in the old books and wonder, what nightmare scenario prompted this? The answer was a goose in armor and a complete lack of common sense. And that, right there, is the heartbeat of our early medieval world. A place so terrified of disorder that it would rather put a pig in a courtroom than admit that sometimes awful things just happen. A place where the line between a practical joke and a legal precedent was as thin as a lance tip. They were building a fortress of law against the howling wilderness of chance. But as we'll see, the real monsters weren't waiting in the woods. They were learning to wear crowns and carry poisoned cups. The fortress walls, it turns out, were easiest to scale from the inside. This obsession with controlling the uncontrollable didn't stop at the town square or the tournament field. It seeped into the very professions that held society together. Take the bakers. In medieval England, bread was life. It was literally the staple. So of course, it was regulated within an inch of its life. The assize of bread and ale laid down the law: weight, price, quality. You couldn't cheat your neighbor on his daily loaf. But the law, in all its exhaustive detail, never mentioned shape. That was a loophole, and sooner or later, someone was bound to stick his head through it. Our guy was a baker in London sometime in the 1300s. Maybe he was a true artist, frustrated by the bland, utilitarian loaves he was forced to produce. Maybe he was just a show-off. He decided to bake a masterpiece. Not just a round loaf, but a beautiful, crowned creation. He embossed a decorative ring around the top, a raised, ornate circle that caught the eye and, crucially, the imagination. He put it out on his market stall, proud as a peacock. People loved it. They called it the royal loaf. It was the talk of the market. And then, as someone always does, a customer made a joke. Looks fit for His Majesty's table, he chuckled, slapping a coin down. In our world, that's a compliment. In medieval London, where suspicion of treason hung in the air like wood smoke, it was a spark. Word traveled up the chain, from gossiping housewife to nosy neighbor to a petty official with ambitions. This official saw the bread, and he didn't see art. He saw sedition, a mockery of the crown, an edible insult. The baker was dragged before a magistrate. The charge? Mocking the image and authority of the crown through insolent baking. Let that sink in. Insolent baking. His defense that it was just pretty bread fell on deaf ears. He was fined into poverty and sentenced to the stocks. They hung the offending loaf around his neck, a soggy, crumbling badge of shame, the first recorded case of carb-based humiliation. And the law moved swiftly to ensure no future flowery rebellions. Parliament decreed that no loaf shall bear royal or sacred resemblance in shape or design. Don't get creative with your carbs. The message was clear. Even in your hunger, you will remember your place. The king's symbol was not for your dinner table. This wasn't just about bread. It was about fear. A king ruling by divine right couldn't afford to be laughed at, even in pastry form. The law that fell on that London baker was a blanket thrown over any spark of symbolic dissent. It told a story. In this world, a man could lose everything for making a loaf of bread too beautiful. This nervous, trigger-happy legalism infected even the places designed for quiet and devotion, the monasteries. We picture monks in silent prayer, their days a monotonous loop of chant and contemplation. But monks were men, and men get bored. In a 14th century Italian abbey, a monk, let's call him Brother Angelo, hit a wall. The Gregorian chants, those same slow, solemn waves of sound, day after day, year after year, felt less like prayer and more like a spiritual grind. He missed melody. He missed a beat. One evening, probably after a nip of the monastery's surprisingly good wine, a tune got stuck in his head. Not a hymn, a tavern song, a popular, foot-tapping little number about a faithless maiden and a broken heart. As he chanted the evening vespers, the rhythm of the secular song synced up with the sacred Latin in his head. Almost without thinking, he let a fragment of the melody slip into his chant. Just a slight lilt on a psalm verse. The brother singing next to him paused, then echoed the lilt. Spread. That tiny spark of musical rebellion lit up the dark choir stalls. Soon, half the abbey was humming the tavern tune in the cloisters, grafting it onto prayers, calling it the Song of Saint Cecilia's Eyes to make it sound holier. It was infectious. Vespers transformed. What was once somber became, if not lively, at least interesting. Pilgrims started asking about the new hymn. They liked it. The abbot, a man who believed holiness and monotony were synonyms, was not amused. He tried to ignore it, but the genie was out of the bottle. Then came the final straw. He caught two monks not just humming, but harmonizing. And one had smuggled in a small lute. The sacred silence was broken by what sounded suspiciously like fun. The abbot exploded. He gathered the entire chapter and delivered a fire and brimstone sermon about discipline and the devil's music. Then he laid down the law: no singing or musical performance shall occur after the hour of sunset. The world's first monastic noise ordinance. The brothers were furious. They argued that their beautiful singing brought them closer to God. The abbot said God preferred silence. The next night, the abbey was tomb quiet, until a faint, defiant whistle of the forbidden tune echoed from the wine cellar. The punishment was severe fasting. The musical revolution was crushed under the weight of ascetic law. But the irony was thicker than monastery stew. In trying to stamp out this creativity, the church accidentally documented and regulated it. The ban spread to other abbeys. Disruptive nocturnal chanting became a punishable offense across Christendom. And in their rebellion, those bored monks had stumbled onto the early roots of polyphony, the layered, harmonious music that would become the glory of the European sacred tradition. They were silenced, but their echo changed music forever. The law sought to kill a joke. It ended up midwifing an art form. This pattern, a bizarre incident, followed by a law trying to slam the door on chaos, reached its peak of absurdity with the case of the drunken fish. Yes, you heard that right. In 15th century England, a nobleman named Lord Humphrey of Cattrick loved his carp pond more than some men love their children. He named the fish. He fed them by hand. He held one-sided conversations with them about estate management. After a lively village festival, Lord Humphrey noticed his prized carp were acting odd, swimming in wobbly circles, bumping into lilies. His brain, steeped in privilege and paranoia, connected two dots. The villagers had been drinking his ale, and now his fish were drunk. He didn't consider heat or sickness or just plain old fish weirdness. He declared it sabotage, an act of piscine poisoning. He demanded an inquiry. The local reeve, not wanting to lose his job, poked at the fish with a stick and solemnly reported they did seem uncommonly jolly. Case closed for Lord Humphrey. He hauled the village elders before him. Their defense was straightforward. "We were drunk, my lord, not the fish." This did not help. A mock trial was held, and the peasants were found guilty of the willful inebriation of aquatic life. Their punishment? A heavy fine, the draining and refilling of the pond, and the creation of a brand new law. Let no man or woman pour ale, wine, or spirituous drink into waters wherein swim the creatures of the Lord. The law of drunken fish was born, and it spread, because no other lord wanted to deal with a nobleman having a meltdown over his tipsy trout. It became shorthand for, "Don't waste good alcohol on animals." The perfect coda to the story? Later, it was determined the fish were just sluggish from a summer heat wave. An entire law, born from a nobleman's delusion and a peasant party. It's a comedy, but a dark one. It shows a system so ready to legislate, so eager to assign blame and create order on parchment, that it would rather outlaw fish intoxication than admit a simple mistake. This was the world they built. A world of chains on church bells to stop them from fleeing, of laws against whistling at night because it scared the horses, of decrees forbidding carpenters from working nude after one guy gave the queen an eyeful. It was a patchwork of frantic, specific rules, each one a tombstone for a single moment of chaos. They believed they could wall out the madness with words on vellum. But they were looking in the wrong direction. The true madness wasn't in the animal pens, the bakeries, or the carp ponds. It was in the highest halls of power. It was quieter, smarter, and far more deadly. It didn't wear the face of a hungry pig or a clumsy goose. It wore a smile, a crown, and a ring with a hidden compartment. While the laws chased runaway livestock, the real predators were learning to poison the well. So here we are. We've built a world from the ground up. A world where every anomaly, from a homicidal pig to a hiccuping fish, gets a law slapped on it. It's a system running on fear, desperately trying to codify God's will into something you can use to fine your neighbor. But this obsession with control, with proper channels and authorized punishments, it creates a weird kind of blindness. Everyone's looking down at the street-level chaos. They're not looking up at the thin, sharp smile of the man holding the goblet. While towns were busy chaining down church bells to stop their ungodly flight, a much quieter rebellion was taking place in the corridors of power. This one didn't need gallows or public stocks. Its weapon was invisible. Its law was not written on parchment, but understood in a glance, in a toast, in the sudden, slow fever that took a rival 2 days after a feast. This was the age where the real art of governance shifted from the battlefield to the dinner table. This was the age of poison. Think about it. If you're a king, a queen, a duke swimming in a sea of ambitious cousins and jealous barons, how do you stay alive? You can't legislate against ambition. You can't pass a law called no trying to murder the king. That's just the job description. So you surround yourself with loyal men. But loyalty is a currency that fluctuates. Except they found one kind that seemed to hold its value, the loyalty of the outsider. The man with no local ties, no family in your court, whose only path to wealth and glory is through you, and you alone. This is where our story twists north, into the cold. They came from the edge of the map. Men from the frozen fjords and the pine-dark forests of Scandinavia. Vikings. But by the late 10th century, the age of mindless raiding was cooling down. These were a new breed, Veterans, mercenaries, men who understood that consistent gold from a steady employer was better than a one-time sack of a monastery, if less glorious. They were warriors shaped by a cruel land, where a man's word was his bond because if you broke it, you'd be found face down in a snowdrift. Their loyalty wasn't given lightly, but when it was absolute. It was a business contract written in blood. Word trickled north of a city that made their richest halls look like shepherds' huts. Constantinople, the city of the world's desire, all marble, gold, and secrets. And the Byzantine Emperor, a man named Basil II, had a problem. He was drowning in betrayal. His own generals, his Greek cousins, they plotted against him like it was a national pastime. He needed a guard that answered to him, and only him. Men who wouldn't give a damn about Byzantine family politics because they couldn't even pronounce the names. So a deal was struck. With Prince Vladimir of Kiev, a Norse-descended ruler who just converted to Christianity, Basil traded his sister's hand in marriage for 6,000 of Vladimir's fiercest warriors. In 988, these northern giants marched into Constantinople. They must have blown the minds of the Byzantines. Tall, blonde, bearded, clad in chainmail and fur, speaking a language that sounded like rocks grinding together. They carried the Great Dane axe, a weapon designed for one purpose: to cleave a man and his horse in half with a single swing. The Greeks called them Varangoi, the Oathmen. We know them as the Varangian Guard. Basil was a shrewd guy. He didn't just stick them on the front lines. He made them his personal bodyguards. Their oath was to his person, not to the empire, not to the crown, but to him. They guarded his bedchamber. They tasted his food not as a symbolic act, but as a literal life-risking duty. They stood behind his throne, axes on their shoulders, their cold blue eyes scanning the crowd of bowing, smiling, scheming Greek courtiers. They understood nothing of the whispered plots, the subtle insults, the complex dance of politics. And that was their greatest strength. Corruption requires shared culture, unspoken understandings. The Varangians were culturally deaf. A bribe meant nothing if you couldn't understand the offer. Their loyalty was their only commodity. And man, did they deliver. Basil II, nicknamed the Bulgar Slayer, took them to war in the Balkans. The Bulgarians called them blue-eyed demons. They fought with a terrifying, methodical ferocity. When Basil infamously blinded 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners, it was the Varangians who formed the impassive wall of steel around the operation. They weren't judges of his cruelty. They were enforcers of his will. That was the deal. Back in Constantinople, their presence changed the game. An assassination plot now had to get through a hallway of Norse giants who saw a dagger not as a political tool, but as a job description. They were the emperor's cease and desist order, written in muscle and iron. They got paid handsomely, in gold coin, the good stuff, and they had the right to plunder the emperor's treasures when he died, a tradition that kept them very invested in his health. They were the ultimate middle managers of violence, incorruptible, terrifyingly efficient, and utterly divorced from the office politics. For a while, this worked like a charm. The law of the land, for the emperor, became the axe of the Varangian. It was simple, clear, and final. No trials for pigs here. If you were a threat, you simply ceased to be. In a weird way, the Byzantines had outsourced their need for order. They couldn't stop their own hearts from scheming, so they hired foreigners with no hearts for Byzantine drama to stand between the schemers and the throne. But time changes everything. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, a new wave of exiles washed up at Constantinople's gates. Anglo-Saxon warriors. Men who had lost everything at the Battle of Hastings. Their king, their land, their honor. They were disciplined, Christian, and burning with a hatred for the Normans. The emperor welcomed them into the guard. Now the brotherhood was a mix. Grizzled Vikings and bitter English earls, united by exile and oath. They became a legend, the last stop for honorable men with no home left. The guard's loyalty was so famous it became proverbial. But even they were bound by their oath to the office of the emperor, not always the man. If a new emperor seized power legitimately, they would switch allegiance with a chilling shrug. Their duty was to the throne, a piece of furniture. This made them the ultimate arbiters of palace coups. Their axes decided who was and who was not the legitimate ruler. They were the living, breathing algorithm of Byzantine power transitions. So, while the villagers of Europe were passing laws about whistling after dark, the real power was being guarded by men who communicated in grunts and axe blows. It was a strange, brutal solution to the problem of human nature. If you can't stop people from being treacherous, hire people who are too simple to be tempted. The Varangians were the pure, uncomplicated idea of medieval justice. See threat, kill threat. No trial, no nonsense. But poison was the superego. It was the weapon of the schemer who found the Varangians too crude, too obvious. Poison was for the sophisticate, the thinker, and as the Middle Ages wore on, and the courts of Europe grew richer, more complex, and more vicious, the thinkers began to outnumber the brutes. The axe could stop a dagger in the dark, but how do you stop a scent on a glove? A drop in a shared cup of friendship wine? The Varangians were a wall, but poison was a mist. It seeped through. The world was learning that the most dangerous laws weren't the ones written down and proclaimed in the square. They were the unwritten ones. The law of survival. The law that said power goes to the one who can smile while serving death. The age of the public, absurd law was fading. The age of the private, perfect crime was dawning. And it would find its most fertile ground not in an empire's palace, but in the hearts of men who claimed to be on a sacred mission from God himself. The Varangians were a fortress, but every fortress has a gate, and the gate is always the weakest point. For all their axes and oaths, they couldn't guard against an enemy that had no face. They were muscle against a shadow, and in the glittering, perfumed courts of Europe's rising kingdoms, Paris, London, Milan, the shadows were getting smarter. While the Norse giants stood watch over emperors, a quieter, more insidious art was being perfected in the alchemist's den and the apothecary's shop. It was the art of making death look like an accident, a fever, God's will. This was the world poison built. Forget the public spectacle of a pig hanging from a gallows. This was justice turned inside out. Private, silent, and utterly deniable. If the early Middle Ages tried to control the outside world with loud, specific laws, the High Middle Ages tried to control the inside world, the world of ambition, lineage, and power, with secrets. And nothing embodied that secret better than a vial of clear liquid, odorless, tasteless, and worth more than a chest of Varangian gold. Let's set the stage properly. You're a noble in, say, 12th century France. Your king is weak. Your neighbor is strong and covets your lands. You could raise an army, but that's expensive, messy, and if you lose, your family is erased. Or, you could invite him to a feast. You could smile, clap him on the back, and offer him the honor of the first drink from a new cask of wine. A week later, he dies in his bed, sweating and delirious. His doctors blame a miasma, bad humors, divine retribution for some unseen sin. You attend his funeral, face a mask of pious sorrow. You offer comfort to his widow, and when the inheritance is settled, your son marries his daughter, and his lands quietly become yours. No war, no scandal, just a tragedy. This wasn't crime, it was politics by other means. This shift required a new kind of professional. Not the soldier, but the scholar. Not the axe-bearer, but the pharmacist. Apothecaries became the most powerful and most feared men in the kingdom. Their shops were libraries of death. Shelves held jars of innocent-sounding herbs. Belladonna, beautiful lady, monkshood, hemlock, arsenic. In the right dose, they were medicine. A grain more, and they were a perfect murder. These men walked a razor's edge. They served kings and queens, mixing their sleeping draughts and their love potions. But the same hand that soothed a queen's migraine could, for the right price, mix a tonic for her troublesome husband that would put him to sleep forever. The church thundered against poisoners, calling their work the devil's craft. But in the shadows, the church used them too. Cardinal with a rival, a bishop who knew too much, a pope needing a stubborn king to see reason. Poison was the great equalizer. It didn't care about your armor, your army, or your divine right. A drop was a drop. And the true masters of this game, often they were women. In a world where men held all the legal and military power, a clever woman learned to wield influence from the shadows. Queens, duchesses, courtiers. Their weapons weren't swords, but goblets, cosmetics, and rings. The stories became legend, whether entirely true or not. Eleanor of Aquitaine's court was rumored to be a nest of subtle poisons. In Italy, the name Borgia became synonymous with treachery served at dinner. Lucrezia Borgia was said to wear a ring with a hidden compartment, a twist of the jewel releasing a single, fatal drop into a cup. Did she? Maybe, maybe not. But the fear was the point. Her reputation was a weapon as potent as any toxin. This created a society running on pure, liquid paranoia. Trust wasn't just fragile. It was suicidal. The rituals of court life became a deadly ballet. The taster, that poor soul whose job was to eat and drink first, became a crucial court official. His grimacing face was the most important news of the day. Kings ate only from specific dishes prepared by specific cooks. They drank from cups they carried with them. A friendly offer of fruit was a potential death sentence. The law, that clumsy public instrument for governing pigs and bread, was useless here. You couldn't outlaw poison. You could only outlaw getting caught. And getting caught was rare. The symptoms, vomiting, fever, slow decline, mimicked 100 common illnesses. The best poisons were slow, mimicking a wasting sickness over weeks or months. A prince might be poisoned at his coming-of-age feast and not die until after his wedding, leaving a tangled web of suspicion that could ignite a civil war. It was chaos, but a refined, elegant chaos. It was chaos with a pedigree. This was the real legacy of that early medieval mindset. They had tried to create a world of order through obsessive lawmaking, but they'd only succeeded in pushing the disorder underground into the human heart. When you make a public spectacle of hanging a pig, you teach people that justice is a show. But when justice is a private affair between a king and his apothecary, you teach people that power is a secret. The law of the land became irrelevant next to the law of the dose. And into this simmering pot of paranoia and ambition, the church threw a torch. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood up and gave a speech that would echo for centuries. He called for a holy war, a crusade, to take back Jerusalem from the infidel, to win glory, forgiveness, and paradise. It was the ultimate public law, proclaimed by God's own vicar. It was a call to channel all that violent, scheming, chaotic energy outward against a common enemy. Thousands took the vow. Knights, peasants, lords. They sewed crosses onto their tunics and set off for the Holy Land, believing they were marching under the banner of divine order. They were going to fight a clear external evil, but they carried their internal world with them. They carried their ambitions, their greeds, their capacity for secrecy and sin. They were leaving a society governed by poison and heading to one where they would be the rulers. They didn't realize they were bringing the infection with them. The Crusades wouldn't be a cleansing fire. They would be the place where the hidden laws of Europe, the laws of betrayal, greed, and hypocrisy, would be written largest of all in blood and sand and sanctimony. The age of the private poison was about to meet the very public cross, and the results would make a trial for a drunken fish look like the pinnacle of civilized behavior. The cry went up across Europe like a great, rusty hinge swinging open. God wills it! Armies of the cross stirred from their petty quarrels and poison plots, turning their faces east. They were going to fight a holy war, a clean war, against a faceless infidel. They would trade the shadowy intrigue of their home courts for the sun-blasted clarity of the desert and the sword. Or so they told themselves. But you don't leave yourself behind when you go on a pilgrimage. The knights who boarded ships for the Levant carried their world in their saddlebags. Their ambition, their taste for luxury, their knack for betrayal, and their profound human weakness. The Holy Land didn't purify them. It just gave their vices a new, glittering backdrop. Jerusalem, when they finally took it in 1099, wasn't just a city. It was the ultimate prize, a physical key to heaven. And the men who held those keys, the Crusader barons, the new kings of Jerusalem, found themselves ruling a kingdom stranger than any fable. They were a tiny, alien elite perched on a powder keg of different faiths and cultures. Surrounded, outnumbered, and permanently besieged, they should have been models of austerity and unity. Instead, they built a paradise of hypocrisy. The contrast was dizzying. One street over from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where pilgrims wept at the stone of Christ's burial, brothels did a roaring trade. The same knights who spent their mornings in prayer spent their nights in those same brothels, their vows of chastity forgotten in the scent of foreign perfume. Taverns in the port of Acre served stronger wine than anything in France, and the soldiers of God drank themselves into stupors, brawling in the streets they were supposed to protect. Why? Because the Holy Land was a pressure cooker. Death was a daily possibility, from a Saracen arrow, from disease, from a rival's dagger. In that constant shadow, earthly pleasures weren't just temptations. They were lifelines. A man who might die tomorrow sees no point in saving his soul today. The church thundered about morality from back in Rome, but the local bishops often looked the other way. They needed these men to hold the line. A drunken knight was still a knight on the wall. A sinful knight was still a sword against Saladin. And then there was the business. Oh, the business. The Crusader states became the world's most ironic marketplace. They had come to conquer, but they stayed to trade. Venetian and Genoese merchants, their ships flying the cross, flooded the ports. And what did they sell? Everything. Silk, spices, slaves, and weapons. To everyone. It was an open secret that Italian traders sold advanced Greek fire and high-quality steel to both the Crusaders and the Muslim armies besieging them. Profit had no religion. The Knights Templar, started as humble protectors of pilgrims, evolved into the first multinational banking corporation, moving vast sums of gold across continents, loaning money to kings, and becoming richer than the kingdoms they served. The ultimate symbol of this corruption was the relic trade. The Crusades caused a frenzy in Europe for holy objects. A splinter of the true cross, a vial of the Virgin's tears, the finger bone of an apostle. The demand was insatiable, and the supply miraculously kept up. And scrupulous knights and merchants ran a massive forgery operation. They'd take any old bone, dip it in incense, wrap it in silk, and spin a convincing tale of its discovery in a looted Jerusalem chapel. They sold these fakes to pious nobles and gullible abbots back home for fortunes. They were literally selling salvation, and it was a seller's market. The holiest war in history had created the world's most blasphemous grift. This was the grim joke at the heart of the Crusader kingdom. They were holding the geographical center of their faith, but they were losing its spiritual center by the hour. The law here wasn't the law of the church or even the law of the crown. It was the law of survival and the law of the deal. Chivalry, that romantic code of honor, crumbled in the desert heat. It was replaced by a brutal, practical cynicism. Alliances shifted daily. Christian barons fought each other over spoils while the enemy gathered at the gates. They kidnapped each other, poisoned each other, and sold each other out. The skills they'd learned in the poisoned courts of Europe were not forgotten. They were refined in the land of Christ. The most tragic figures in all of this were the idealists, the young knights who actually believed the sermons, who came seeking redemption and glory. They either died quickly, disillusioned, or they learned. They learned that the holy city was just another city, full of thieves. They learned that the holy war was just another war, full of profiteers. They learned to keep their faith private and their purse public. They became hard, cynical, and lonely. They were strangers in a strange land, serving a god who seemed to have left the building. And all the while, the real enemy watched. Men like Saladin weren't just military geniuses. They were students of their foes. They saw the decadence, the division, the greed. They saw Crusader knights wearing silks and drinking fine wine in fortified palaces while their own people squabbled. Saladin didn't just see an army. He saw a rotting structure. He knew that a kingdom built on stolen gold and internal betrayal doesn't need to be conquered. It just needs a good, hard push. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 wasn't just a military defeat. It was a moral collapse. When Saladin's armies breached the walls, they found a kingdom already dead from the inside, hollowed out by its own contradictions. The knights who fled or were captured weren't the shining paladins of legend. They were tired, rich, compromised men, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. They had gone to the Holy Land to escape the petty, poisoned politics of Europe, but they brought the poison with them in their hearts. And in the end, the kingdom of heaven they tried to build on earth turned out to be just a shabby, gilded copy of the world they'd left behind. The only difference was the quality of the sunlight. The laws of human nature, greed, fear, ambition, had followed them across the sea and conquered them long before the Saracens ever raised a sword. They had come to write a new chapter in holy law. Instead, they just proved the oldest law of all: you can't outrun yourself. The dream was over. The last Crusader knights straggled back to Europe, or were swallowed by the East, or simply vanished into the shifting sands of history. They returned to a continent that had changed in their absence. The world of their fathers, the world of isolated manors, local lords, and simple public laws about pigs and bread, was dying. In its place was something new, something more connected, more intellectual, and in many ways more dangerous. The Crusades, for all their failure, had torn open a window. Europe had seen the wealth of Byzantium, the science of the Arabs, the vastness of the world. They brought back more than silks and sad stories. They brought back ideas. And one of the most potent ideas was this: the universe might operate on rules that weren't just God's whims, but could be studied, understood, and even manipulated. This is where our two threads, the absurd public law and the lethal private poison, begin to twist together into the modern world. The apothecary, the poisoner's supplier, started to become the alchemist and then the chemist. The quest wasn't just for a better hemlock anymore. It was for the philosopher's stone, for the secret of transmuting base metal into gold, for the elixir of life. It was magic slowly putting on the lab coat of science. In dim, firelit workshops, men like the 13th century scholar Albertus Magnus experimented. They distilled liquids, recorded reactions, and cataloged the properties of substances. They sought divine knowledge, but their notebooks were full of very earthly, very useful information. They learned to purify arsenic into a fine, white, tasteless powder. They discovered the lethal properties of antimony and mercury, the same processes that might, in their minds, one day reveal the secret of creation, could today produce a poison of terrifying precision. The Church watched these natural philosophers with deep suspicion. This was knowledge that threatened to put power, the power of transformation, the power of life and death, into human hands without the need for prayer or papal decree. This new knowledge didn't stay in the lab. It flowed back into the courts, now armed with a terrifying scientific legitimacy. Poisoning in the 14th and 15th centuries wasn't just an art. It was an applied science. The symptoms could be engineered. Want a rival to die screaming in apparent agony, as if from a divine plague? A certain mix would do that. Want him to simply fade away over months, like a man consumed by melancholy? A slow, low dose of mercury in his wine would manage it. The howdunit of the murder became a technical challenge, a puzzle for the intellectually ambitious assassin. And this finally forced the law to evolve. It could no longer just be about the what, the dead body. It had to be about the how. The medieval bureaucrat, that dangerous creature we started with, now had to become a detective. He had to understand cause and effect in a way his pig-prosecuting ancestors never did. The first inklings of forensic investigation were born from this arms race. Was the Lord's sudden illness truly a fever? Or was there a bitter almond scent on his lips hinting at cyanide? Did the rich merchant's wife really die of a sudden colic? Or were there peculiar grains of a white powder in the dregs of her bedtime posset? It created a new kind of paranoia, one backed by reason, not just superstition. Fear of witchcraft was a fear of the irrational. Fear of poisoning was a fear of a rational, intelligent, hidden enemy. It was a colder, more sophisticated dread. Kings began to employ their own court alchemists not just to seek gold, but to develop antidotes, to test food, to be one step ahead of the poisoner's latest formula. The taster was now sometimes accompanied by a proof master with a set of early chemical tests, dipping a silver needle, observing how a drop of liquid evaporated on a hot coal. The law scrambled to catch up. Decrees were passed banning the sale of certain substances to anyone but licensed physicians. Apothecaries had to keep detailed records of who bought arsenic and for what purpose. It was the birth of regulated substances. But just like the law against armor-clad geese, it was a response to a problem that had already happened. A barn door locked after the horse was not only stolen but had been dissolved in a vat of aqua regia. So what's the through line? From the pig trial to the poisoned prince? It's the story of humanity trying to impose order on a chaotic universe, and learning that the greatest source of chaos is always human nature itself. They started by putting the natural world on trial. Animals, the weather, even inanimate objects like bells. They blamed the beast, the storm, the metal. They created loud, specific, often ridiculous laws to fence in that external chaos. But slowly, painfully, they were forced to turn the lens around. The real enemy wasn't out there in the forest or the farmyard. It was in the castle, in the chapel, in the human heart with its limitless capacity for greed, envy, and clever cruelty. They couldn't pass a law against ambition. They couldn't legislate away betrayal. So they tried to manage it with secrets, with poisons, with private, silent violence. And when that became too sophisticated, when science began to illuminate the dark corners of their own malice, the law had to grow up too. It had to move from spectacle to investigation, from judging the obvious to uncovering the hidden. The journey from the public gallows for a pig to the private, scientific autopsy of a poisoned duke is the journey from the early medieval mind to the modern one. It's the story of us realizing that the monsters aren't under the bed. They're inside us, and they're really, really smart. The Middle Ages didn't end with a bang. They faded, giving way to the Renaissance, the Age of Discovery, the Enlightenment. But they left us with this legacy, a legal system forever chasing the inventions of human mischief. For every new technology, a new law. For every novel sin, a novel statute. The bureaucratic urge to classify and control, born in those smoky medieval halls, is still with us. We're still trying to legislate against the next goose in armor, the next clever poison, the next unimaginable thing one person will do to another. Because the most insane incident, the one that prompts all the laws, is always just around the corner. And it's always inevitably human. Our story has swept across centuries, from muddy village squares to golden thrones, from the cold fjords to the holy desert. We've seen laws born from panic and power plays born from poison. But to truly understand the end of this era, we have to look not at kings or knights, but at a dreamer. A man who looked at the rules of his world, both God's and man's, and decided to literally jump over them. His name was Aylmer of Malmesbury, an 11th century English monk. In a time when the law was busy governing the horizontal, property, animals, the boundaries of fields, Aylmer was obsessed with the vertical. He watched birds. He devoured ancient texts not just on theology, but on mathematics and the mechanics of the natural world. In his mind, a dangerous idea took root. If God gave birds the sky, and if man was made in God's image, then perhaps flight wasn't just for the angels. Perhaps it was a puzzle waiting to be solved. This was heresy of a peculiar kind. It wasn't about denying God. It was about encroaching on his departments. The medieval world had a place for everything. Fish swam, beasts walked, men prayed and fought, angels flew. To blur those lines was to invite chaos. The trial of the pig punished an animal for acting like a man. What would they do to a man who tried to act like a bird? Aylmer didn't care. In secret, he built wings. Wood, cloth, careful calculations born of observation and faith. He wasn't trying to be a demon. He was trying to be a scholar of God's greatest work, creation. To his brother monks, it must have looked like madness or worse, witchcraft. But on a clear day around the year 1010, Aylmer climbed the tower of Malmesbury Abbey, fastened his handmade wings, and leapt. For a few glorious, heart-stopping seconds, it worked. The chronicler says he flew more than a furlong, over 600 feet. He soared above the abbey grounds, the wind in his habit, the earth a distant picture. Imagine the sight for those below, a monk, flying. It must have looked like a miracle or a terrifying omen. Then, as all pioneers learn, theory met practice. He crashed, breaking both his legs. He survived, but was crippled for life. As they carried him away, he reportedly muttered that his mistake was forgetting to add a tail for stability. The church's reaction was swift and definitive. The abbot convened a council. Aylmer's experiment was declared not brilliant, but reckless, an act of hubris that tempted God. A new rule was entered into the monastery's code. No monk shall attempt to fly. The ban on flying monks. It sounds like another absurd, specific law, but its meaning was profound. It was the establishment drawing a line in the sand of human ambition. This far and no further. The sky was not yours to conquer. Order, both social and cosmic, depended on men staying in their God-ordained lane. Aylmer's story is the counterpoint to everything we've seen. The pig trial was about punishing a beast for stepping out of its place. Aylmer's grounding was about punishing a man for the same sin. The law, in both cases, was a tool to enforce a rigid, preordained hierarchy. But Aylmer's dream, the dream of flight, of transcending limits, would not be so easily chained. It was the human spirit, curious and defiant, pushing against the walls of the medieval world. This same spirit was at work in those alchemist labs, seeking to transform matter. It was in the minds of navigators who would soon sail past the edges of the map. The medieval system was a complex machine of control, but the fuel inside it, human ingenuity, was inherently explosive. You could pass a law against flying monks. You couldn't pass a law against the thought, what if? And so, as the Middle Ages waned, the contradictions became unbearable. The Crusades had shown the gap between holy ideal and grubby reality. The poison trade had shown that faith was no shield against a clever mind with a vial. The flying monk had shown that even the most sacred institutions couldn't keep a curious man on the ground forever. The final act of the poison drama played out in this twilight. Poisoning had become so refined, so woven into the fabric of power, that it began to consume itself. The paranoia reached a fever pitch. In the court of King Frederick II of Sicily in the 13th century, it wasn't just about avoiding poison. It was about understanding it scientifically. He was said to host banquets where condemned prisoners were fed different toxic substances so his physicians could meticulously record the symptoms and time of death. Poison was no longer just a tool for murder. It was a subject of study, a dark science. The law here was not about prevention, but about data collection. The ultimate bureaucrat had arrived, treating human life as an experimental variable. This is where the legacy of the early, absurd laws meets its grim, logical conclusion. That original impulse, to control, to categorize, to bring everything under the dominion of rules, had started with animals and bells. It ended with kings conducting clinical trials on prisoners with poison. The method had become sophisticated, but the mindset was eerily familiar. A desperate, cold-blooded attempt to impose a sick kind of order on the fundamental chaos of mortality itself. The world was outgrowing its container. The narrow, vertical structure of medieval life, with God and king at the top, then nobles, then priests, then peasants, then animals, was cracking. The horizontal world of trade, ideas, and exploration was pushing through. The Varangian Guard, those loyal outsiders, were gone, their empire fallen. The last Crusader knights were a memory. A new age was coming, one that would call itself a rebirth, the Renaissance. But you don't just shake off 1,000 years of history. The Renaissance would be born with medieval fingerprints all over it. Its art would be funded by banking families who learned finance from the Templars. Its science would be driven by the same curiosity that doomed Aylmer of Malmesbury. Its politics would be just as deadly as any medieval court, only with better poison and more elegant lies. The laws born from one insane incident, they never went away, they just evolved. The fear that created them, the fear of chaos, of the unknown, of the beast within and without, that never went away either. We just got better at dressing it up in finer clothes and more complicated words. The medieval bureaucrat, in his soul, is still with us. He's just traded his parchment for a policy paper, and his fear of demonic pigs for fear of whatever new, unimaginable chaos tomorrow might bring. The fortress walls of the Middle Ages didn't fall in a day. They eroded, worn down by a slow tide of money, ideas, and plain human exhaustion. Let's look at the quiet end of our three great stories: the law, the poison, and the holy war. First, the law. Those bizarre, specific statutes didn't just vanish. They fossilized. The decree against armored geese, the ban on crown-shaped bread, the ordinance on nocturnal whistling. They lingered on the books for centuries, long after anyone remembered why they were written. Town clerks would find them while searching for precedents on property disputes, scratch their heads, and move on. They became curiosities, legal jokes. Their power drained away because the worldview that birthed them, a world where a bell could be guilty of fleeing, where a fish's behavior required a legislative response, was fading. People were starting to see the world less as a mystical drama full of symbolic actors and more as a mechanism, a thing that could be understood through reason, not just regulated by decree. The law began to concern itself less with punishing cosmic disorder and more with managing human commerce and crime. The pig was forgotten. The contract became king. Now the poison. This golden age couldn't last. The very paranoia it created became its downfall. By the late Middle Ages, courts were so saturated with suspicion that trust became a rare, precious commodity. This wasn't sustainable. You can't run a government, let alone a banquet, if everyone thinks the gravy is a potential murder weapon. A new ideal began to emerge, fueled in part by the returning Crusaders' tales of Eastern perfidy, and in part by a growing Renaissance emphasis on transparency and honor, the ideal of the gentleman. The gentleman did not poison. It was cowardly, feminine, underhanded. The gentleman challenged you to a duel. He killed you face to face, in the clean light of day. Poison became the mark of the tyrant, the schemer, the coward. It never disappeared, of course, it just went deeper underground, becoming the weapon of last resort, not the first tool of statecraft. The law, now armed with rudimentary forensics, began to catch up, turning the poisoner from a shadowy artist into a detectable criminal. And the Crusades? Their end was the messiest of all. There was no final, glorious battle. The last Crusader strongholds, like Acre, fell not with a heroic last stand, but in a chaotic scramble of betrayal and panic. The knights who escaped didn't come home as legendary heroes. They came home as grim, weathered men, often broke, always disillusioned. They brought with them strange manners, a taste for Eastern luxuries, and a cynical, world-weary air that didn't sit well with the still fervent piety of Europe. But they also brought something else, a template for failure. The Crusader states had been a laboratory. In them, Europeans tried to build a perfect, holy society from scratch. And it had rotted from the inside out, eaten by the same greed and hypocrisy they'd brought with them. For the smartest minds watching, the merchants, the philosophers, the early humanists, the lesson was clear. You could not build heaven on earth with the tools of hell. Divine mandate was not enough. A kingdom needed good administration, sound economics, and realistic diplomacy more than it needed the blessing of a distant pope. This was the real end of the medieval dream. It wasn't defeated by Muslims or Mongols. It was defeated by its own internal contradictions. The faith that built the cathedrals wasn't strong enough to control the men who fought in their shadow. The laws that tried to govern everything couldn't govern the human heart. The quest for purity led only to deeper corruption. So what was left? A continent picking up the pieces. The old vertical order was shattered, but nothing clear had taken its place. In the chaos, there was opportunity. This was the space where the modern world would be born. The city-states of Italy, with their merchant princes and artist patrons, thrived in this ambiguity. Explorers, no longer seeking Jerusalem, set out to find new routes to the riches of the East, accidentally stumbling upon new worlds. Scholars began to look back past the Church Fathers to the original texts of Greece and Rome, finding wisdom that didn't depend on divine revelation. The legacy of the Middle Ages wasn't a set of answers. It was a set of brutal, beautiful, and often ridiculous questions. How do we live together? How do we balance faith and reason? How do we control our own capacity for chaos? They answered with trials for animals and secret poisons, with holy wars and flying monks. Their answers were, by our lights, mostly wrong, often monstrous, but they were asking the right questions. And in their failed, frantic attempts to answer them, they built the foundation we stand on. Our legal systems, our political nightmares, our enduring struggle to find order in a universe that seems eternally inclined toward the absurd. We like to think we're so far beyond them, that we're rational, scientific, enlightened. But watch the news. Listen to the political rhetoric. Look at the strange, specific laws still on our books. We're still building walls against chaos. We're still afraid of the beast, though we give it new names. We still have our poisons, though they are digital and psychological. And we still launch crusades, though we call them by other titles. The costumes have changed. The stage lights are brighter. But the play, my friends, is still the same. The human one. So the next time you hear about some ridiculous regulation, or some hidden scandal, or some grand, idealistic campaign that seems to be going sour, remember the pig, the poison, and the pilgrim. They're not just history. They're the blueprint. We're all living in the long, strange aftermath of the Middle Ages, doing our best to navigate a world built from one insane incident after another. And the most terrifying, wonderful part is this: we're still adding our own. We've followed the trail from the ridiculous to the sublime, from the gallows to the throne room, and out into the desert. We've seen how a world that tried to legislate its fear of chaos ended up breeding a more sophisticated chaos within its own heart. But history doesn't have clean end credits. The Middle Ages didn't just stop. They bled, slowly and irrevocably, into what came next. Their ghosts didn't haunt castles. They took up residence in systems, in habits of mind, in the very structures of the power that followed. Let's talk about residue. The first and most obvious is in our language. We still use medieval terms for modern problems. We call a brutal, indiscriminate attack a dragon slayer when it's anything but chivalrous. We accuse politicians of poisoning the well of public discourse. A complex, unwinnable situation is a holy war. We've kept their metaphors because they still fit. The psychological landscape they mapped, of betrayal, blind zeal, and futile struggle against monstrous problems, is still our own. Then there's the law. Our modern legal system, with its barristers and precedents and obsession with procedure, is a direct descendant of those medieval canon and civil law courts. They took the Roman idea of law and filtered it through the church's need for order. The spectacle of the pig trial is gone, but the machinery that enabled it, the charging, the defense, the judgment, that machinery was refined, not scrapped. We just replaced the pig with a corporation, the accusation of witchcraft with a violation of securities regulation. The medieval bureaucrat's descendant is the compliance officer, and he is just as dangerous, armed with spreadsheets instead of scripture. But the deepest residue is in our attitude toward authority and secrecy. The Middle Ages taught the West a brutal lesson. Power is rarely what it seems. The king who proclaims divine right might be a puppet of his poisoner wife. The bishop preaching chastity might be selling indulgences. The knight bearing the cross might be running a smuggling ring. This produced a deep cultural cynicism, a habit of looking for the hidden motive, the secret plot. It's the birth of the conspiracy theory. When you've lived in a world where the real laws are unwritten and death comes in a toast, you learn not to take things at face value. That hypervigilant, suspicious streak is a medieval inheritance. We see it every time we doubt an official story, for better or worse. And what of our heroes? The archetypes forged then still shape our stories. The flawed knight, seeking redemption but mired in sin. That's every noir detective and superhero. The wise, scheming counselor, the modern political advisor. The rogue with a code of honor, the pirate, the smuggler, the hacker. The Varangian Guard, the loyal outsider, the man of few words who gets the dirty job done, is the template for 1,000 action movie protagonists. We've just swapped the axe for a sniper rifle and Constantinople for a dystopian city. But here's the crucial twist. The Renaissance and the Enlightenment didn't erase this medieval substrate. They built on it, often by claiming to reject it. The humanists said, "Enough of God's mystery. Let's study man." But the man they chose to study was often the ideal, virtuous citizen, a secular remake of the pious knight. The scientists said, "Enough of superstition. Let us observe nature." But the order they sought in the stars and the elements was just a new version of the divine order, now written in mathematics. They replaced the great chain of being with the scientific taxonomy, but it was still a chain, still a hierarchy meant to explain everything's place. Even the great voyages of discovery, which seem like such a clean break, were fueled by a medieval hunger. They weren't just seeking spices. They were still, in part, seeking Prester John, the mythical Christian king in the East. They were looking for new Jerusalems, earthly paradises. They carried the cross with them alongside the compass. The conquest of the New World was, in its psychology, the last and most terrible crusade. A holy war for gold and souls, with the same catastrophic mix of idealism and atrocity. So we have to let go of the idea of a neat before and after. The Renaissance wasn't a light switching on. It was a slow dawn, and for a long time, the landscape was lit by both the dying embers of the old world and the new, uncertain sun. A 16th century prince might sponsor Michelangelo and keep an astrologer poisoner on retainer. He might read Machiavelli's cold political realism by day and tremble at a rumor of witchcraft by night. This is the messy truth of history. It doesn't progress in a straight line. It loops, spirals, and leaves debris everywhere. The age of poison gave us the foundations of chemistry. The age of holy war gave us the framework of international banking. The age of absurd laws gave us the bedrock of legal bureaucracy. We are not post-medieval. We are neo-medieval, living in a world where the old structures have been retrofitted with new technology, but where the same fundamental human dramas play out on a global digital stage. The castle walls are gone, but we've built firewalls. The royal seal is obsolete, but we use encryption. The confession has become the tell-all interview. The trial by combat has become the vicious lawsuit. The components are familiar. It's just the packaging that's changed. As we move into the final part of our story, we have to ask, if this is our inheritance, what do we do with it? Are we doomed to repeat their cycles of fervor and corruption, of public law and private sin? Or can we, with the benefit of their bloody hindsight, finally learn the lesson they struggled so hard to see? The lesson that the enemy isn't out there, in the form of infidels or beasts or runaway bells. The enemy, and the only hope for order, has always been within us. We've arrived at the end of our long journey, but not at an end to the story, because the story is us. We've walked through a gallery of the past, looking at portraits of panic, ambition, faith, and failure. We've seen how a single stupid incident could bend the law, and how a silent, clever sin could bend a kingdom. The question that hangs in the air now, as we stand looking back at that vast, intricate tapestry, is simple. So what's the point of knowing that a drunk knight inspired an anti-DUI law for jousting? That a bored monk with wings was grounded by decree? That the most loyal soldiers in Christendom were pagan-born axemen? It's more than just trivia. It's a masterclass in human nature. The Middle Ages, for all their strangeness, hold up a brutally honest mirror. They show us ourselves without the filters of modern politeness, without the illusions of inevitable progress. They show us raw. Let's break down what that mirror reflects. First, it shows our desperate need for narrative. The medieval mind couldn't handle "it just happened. A pig kills a child?" That's not a random tragedy. It's a morality play. The pig is an actor of evil, and must be tried as such. A bell falls in a storm? It didn't fall. It fled. We are, then and now, storytelling animals. We will force events into a plot with cause and effect, heroes and villains, even if we have to invent them. Today, we don't put animals on trial, usually. But we spin elaborate narratives around stock market dips, political scandals, and personal misfortunes. We still can't accept chaos. We have to have a why, even when there isn't one. The medieval bureaucrat writing the law against the bell is the ancestor of the pundit explaining a complex crisis in 3 bullet points. Second, it shows that systems are built by people and people are flawed. The entire edifice of medieval society, feudal oaths, church hierarchy, chivalric codes, was designed to create stability. And at every turn, it was subverted by the very humans it was meant to govern. Lords broke oaths. Knights used chivalry as a PR cover for butchery. Clergy used divine authority to amass wealth and power. The poison in the goblet wasn't an anomaly. It was the logical endpoint of a system where power was absolute and checks were few. It's the ultimate reminder. You can design the most beautiful system in the world, but if you don't account for greed, fear, and ambition, it will be used for ends you never imagined. Our own systems, political, financial, digital, are facing the same relentless stress test. Third, and most importantly, It shows the eternal gap between ideal and reality. This is the grand, tragic theme of the age. The ideal was Christendom, a unified kingdom of God on earth. The reality was squabbling kingdoms and a corrupt papacy. The ideal was the chivalrous knight, protector of the weak. The reality was often a thug in shiny armor. The ideal was the crusade, a pure pilgrimage of arms. The reality was a messy, grubby colonial venture fueled by greed. They preached poverty and built palaces. They preached peace and waged constant war. This isn't just medieval hypocrisy. It's human condition. We are creatures who can imagine perfection, justice, peace, purity, and are forever frustrated by our inability to live up to it. The Middle Ages are so compelling because they wore that struggle on the outside. They built heavenward cathedrals while the streets ran with filth. They created exquisite, illuminated manuscripts about damnation while passing laws about drunk fish. The contradiction wasn't hidden. It was woven into the fabric of life. So what do we take from this? A sense of superiority? Thank God we're not like those backwards, superstitious people. That would be a profound mistake. The technology has changed. The knowledge has expanded. But the raw materials, the human heart with its capacity for both great love and great cruelty, its brilliance and its stupidity, are the same. We are not looking at aliens. We are looking at our grandparents, 1,000 times removed. Their fears are our fears, dressed in different costumes. Their solutions, laws, oaths, secrets, crusades, are templates we still use. Their failures are cautionary tales we are still living. The call to action here, in the middle of our reflection, is this: use this history not as a spectacle, but as a tool. When you see a new law that seems reactive and bizarre, think of the pig. What panic is it trying to codify? When you see grand, idealistic rhetoric, think of the Crusades. What ugly realities might it be papering over? When you see absolute, unquestionable power, think of the poison. What silent corruptions might it be breeding? The past doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. We have the advantage of hearing the previous verses. We can see the rhyme scheme of power, the meter of human folly. We don't have to be surprised when the chorus comes around again. The medieval world ended not with a solution, but with exhaustion and a slow turning towards new questions. Our task is to keep asking better questions, with the humility that comes from knowing our long, weird, bloody family history. We are the children of the pig trial and the poison cup. Let's try to be wiser children. We've peered into the mirror and seen the familiar, flawed face of humanity staring back. But history isn't just a passive reflection. It's an active ingredient. The seeds planted in the furrows of the medieval world didn't just grow into the Renaissance and modernity. Some grew into twisted, thorny vines that still snake through our present. To truly finish our story, we need to trace a few of these vines, the specific, enduring legacies that shape the contours of our world today, for better and for worse. Legacy 1, the bureaucratic beast. The medieval clerk, with his quill and his ledger, was the ancestor of the modern state. His obsession with recording, regulating, and taxing was the germ of administration. The Doomsday Book, William the Conqueror's Great Survey of England in 1086, wasn't about stories or souls. It was about assets. Who owns what? How much is it worth? What can we tax? This was a revolution in thinking, reducing the messy complexity of life, forests, fields, people, to data points in a book. It was the first spreadsheet. That impulse, born from a conqueror's need for control, never left us. It evolved into the census, the social security number, the credit score, the digital profile. The modern state, and now the tech platform, knows us not as stories but as data, just like the pigs and acres in the Doomsday Book. The law is no longer just a decree. It's an algorithm in a benefit system, a line of code in a content moderation filter. The medieval bureaucrat's dream of a perfectly ordered, cataloged world is alive and well in Silicon Valley and government databases. The question is no longer, is this pig guilty? But, does this data point fit the model? Legacy 2, the outsider as enforcer. The Varangian Guard solved a trust problem by importing loyalty. This template has been used again and again. The Swiss guards at the Vatican, the Gurkhas in the British Army, the French Foreign Legion, the practice of using foreign policy tools or international coalitions to enact a nation's will. The logic is the same. Find a group whose interests are perfectly aligned with yours because they have no other home, no competing loyalties within your system. They are the ultimate mercenaries of order. In our globalized world, this plays out in corporations hiring outside consultants to make brutal cuts, or in nations using drone pilots stationed thousands of miles away to wage war. The psychological distance, like the Varangians' cultural distance, makes the hard, disloyal work easier. It's clean, clinical, and outsourced. Legacy 3, the Holy War, retooled. The Crusades invented the concept of the ideological total war, where the enemy is not just a political rival but an existential evil, infidel, heretic, and where victory is not negotiated but total. This framework did not disappear with the fall of Acre. It was secularized and supercharged. The religious fervor was poured into new vessels. Revolutionary purity, the reign of terror, racial destiny, colonialism, fascism, and ideological supremacy, the Cold War. The language changes, the wheel of history, the master race, the axis of evil. But the tune is the same, a call to a righteous, uncompromising struggle that justifies any means. The medieval knights who believed they could purge the Holy Land with blood planted the intellectual bomb that would explode for centuries. Legacy 4, the weaponized secret. The poisoner's art was the ultimate privatization of justice. It took the public function of punishment and made it a private, deniable tool. This legacy is the deep state, the shadow war, the intelligence agency, the smear campaign, the anonymous leak. It's the understanding that real power often operates in the dark, far from the theatrical laws and public decrees. Our world is saturated with this. We accept that diplomats have back channels, that corporations have black budgets, that politics runs on opposition research and sealed court documents. We live in a society of official, public truths and unofficial, private realities, a duality the medieval poisoners would have understood perfectly. The goal is no longer to hang your enemy in the square, but to make him disappear from the narrative entirely. Legacy 5, the performance of legitimacy. The medieval king needed the church's blessing. The knight needed the rituals of chivalry. The law needed the spectacle of the trial. All of it was theater designed to cloak raw power in the garments of legitimacy. This is the origin of public relations, of political branding, of optics. Every modern leader, corporation, and institution engages in this. We don't just do things, we stage them. We craft the narrative, control the imagery, manage the symbols. A modern political convention, with its balloons and soaring speeches, is the direct descendant of a royal coronation. A corporate social responsibility report is the heir to a noble patron building a chapel to atone for his sins. It's the same principle. Power is unstable without a story that makes it seem right, necessary, and good. Seeing these legacies isn't about casting blame. It's about gaining clarity. We are not fighting medieval problems. We are fighting the mature, technologically advanced descendants of medieval solutions. The pig trial's descendant is the culture war outrage cycle. The Varangian Guard's descendant is the privatized military contractor. The Crusades' descendant is the apocalyptic rhetoric of our political extremes. The poisoner's descendant is the hacker in a foreign bunker. This is the final, sobering lesson of the long Middle Ages. There is no after. There is only adaptation. The tools change, the scale expands, the speed accelerates. But the workshop where these tools are forged, the human heart with its fear, its greed, its longing for order, and its taste for dominion, that workshop hasn't been renovated. We're still using the same blueprints. The only hope we have is to finally, honestly read them, and with clear eyes, decide if we want to keep building the same way. Here we are, at the end of our long walk through 1,000 years. We've seen the clown show and the tragedy, the faith and the filth, the grand designs and the petty panics. We've watched a civilization try to build a cage for chaos, only to find the most dangerous chaos was the builder's own reflection. So what's the final word? Not a summary, but a takeaway. A piece of mental equipment to carry with you now that the story is done. Think of the Middle Ages not as a time but as a condition. The medieval condition. It's the state of being caught between a dream of perfect order and the messy, blood and guts reality of being alive. It's the gap between the cathedral spire and the gutter. And here's the uncomfortable truth. We never left that condition. We just got better interior decorating. Our cathedrals are space stations and particle accelerators, reaching for a heaven made of pure knowledge. Our gutters are comment sections and ideological trenches, flowing with the same old refuse of hatred and fear. We still have our sacred texts, constitutions, scientific doctrines, economic theories, that we treat with religious fervor and use to excommunicate heretics. We still have our knights, celebrity activists, tech visionaries, political firebrands, whose shining armor often dents under the weight of their own hypocrisy. We still have our poison, flowing not in goblets but in pipelines of misinformation and algorithmic outrage. The medieval world's greatest lesson is that the problem is never out there. The pig wasn't the problem. The Saracen wasn't the problem. The runaway bell wasn't the problem. The problem was the mind that looked at a tragic accident and saw a demonic plot. The mind that looked at a different culture and saw a cosmic enemy. The mind that believed it could hang, chain, or legislate the unpredictable hum of existence into silent obedience. That mind is our mind. We inherit it. It's the mind that, when faced with a complex pandemic, looks for a single villain to put on trial. It's the mind that, when terrified by change, builds walls and writes laws to stop the future from happening. It's the mind that seeks purity, racial, ideological, national, and is willing to launch crusades to achieve it. We have the same software. We're just running it on faster hardware with a nicer interface. So this isn't a history lesson. It's a diagnostic, a way to check your own temperature. When you feel that surge of righteous certainty, that urge to lay down the law, to find the simple culprit for a complex pain, that's the medieval bureaucrat in you, reaching for his quill. When you are captivated by a grand, cleansing narrative that promises to purge the world of evil, that's the Crusader in you, taking the cross. When you are tempted to deal with a rival not openly, but with a whispered rumor, a hidden betrayal, a carefully crafted lie, that's the poisoner in you, twisting the ring. This is not about guilt. It's about awareness. These aren't ghosts from a dead past. They are living patterns in the human psyche. The Middle Ages are the case study of what happens when those patterns are given the keys to the kingdom. The results are the stories we've just told. By turns hilarious, horrifying, and heartbreaking. But there's a flip side to this inheritance. They also left us the antidotes if we choose to see them. They left us the questioning monk, like Aylmer, who looked at the sky and thought not forbidden. But how? They left us the pragmatic merchant, crossing cultural lines not with a sword but with a scale, building connections in the ruins of failed crusades. They left us the scribe, who amidst the crazy laws, preserved the old knowledge that would one day help us think differently. And they left us, in the sheer, exhausted failure of their grand projects, the most valuable lesson of all, the humility of unintended consequences. They aimed for heaven and got the Inquisition. They aimed for holy purity and got the blood-soaked sands of the Holy Land. They aimed for order and got a law against drunken fish. Their legacy is a colossal monument to the fact that we are not the authors of our story. We are its often surprised, frequently baffled editors. Final call to action. So take this story with you. When you navigate your own life, your own community, your own moment in this long, weird human saga, use it. Be suspicious of simple stories. Be wary of the call to purity. Laugh with compassion at the inevitable, ridiculous laws we will pass in our panic. And remember the view from Aylmer's tower, just before he jumped. It wasn't the view of a rebel or a heretic. It was the view of a man who saw the world not as a cage of rules, but as a vast, mysterious, and breathtaking system waiting to be understood. He crashed, yes, but he flew first. We stand on the rubble of their world, which they built from the rubble of Rome. Our world, too, will one day be rubble for someone else to sort through. Let's try to leave behind less fear and more wonder. Fewer gallows for scapegoats and more blueprints for wings. The most important law we can pass is not one that chains down the bells of change, but one that protects the dreamers who dare to listen to their ring. Let's leave the broad sweep of history for a moment. Let's step through a specific gate, the gate of the wooden circus in Constantinople in the year 1043. The air here smells different from the rest of the city. Less myrrh and sewage, more pine tar, sweat, and sour beer. This is the Varangian Quarter, and our guide is not an emperor or a chronicler, but a man with sore shoulders and an empty purse. His name is Haraldur Sigurdsson. You might know him by a different name, Harald Hardrada, the man who would one day be king of Norway and die at Stamford Bridge. But today, he is just another tall, angry Norseman with an axe to grind and a fortune to win. He arrived a year ago, a prince in exile after a failed uprising. The glittering shock of the city was a physical blow. In Norway, a king's hall was wood and smoke. Here, the streets were paved with marble, the ceilings were gold, and the people spoke in a musical, incomprehensible murmur. He and his crew were ushered not to a barracks, but to a palace wing. They were given a vaulted hall for their own, told they could have their own laws, their own priest, their own stewards. It was a gilded cage of incredible privilege. Their only duty, be ready to kill for the emperor. Haraldur's first week was a blur of procedure and profound alienation. A smooth-faced Greek official, a logothete, interviewed him through a translator. The questions were not about his lineage or battle prowess, but about his oath. Did he understand it was to the person of Emperor Michael for the Paphlagonian and to him alone? Not to the Senate, not to the general of the armies, not to the emperor's brother, the powerful John the Orphanatrophos. To the man, Haraldur grunted his understanding. He was given a milliaresian, a silver coin, as a symbol of his first month's pay. Felt light. He was used to arm rings of solid gold. The reality of the job set in quickly. For days, nothing. They stood. They stood in blinding sun outside the Chrysotriclinos, the main throne room, as a river of silk-clad officials flowed past, staring at the floor to avoid the Varangians' eyes. They stood in the dank cool of the palace vaults, guarding a door behind which, they were told, lay the imperial treasury. They stood and they got to know each other. The guard was a babel of tongues. Old Norwegians like Haraldur, who spat when they mentioned the upstart Danish king. Danes who spat back. Sweres from Sweden who kept to themselves. And the newest, oddest element, Englisk. Big, sad-eyed men from the lost kingdom of Wessex, who spoke a language closer to the Norse than to Greek, but who prayed to the same crucifix as the emperor. They were refugees from their own conquered land, and they fought with a silent, desperate fury that even the Vikings respected. They bonded not over homeland, but over exile, over the shared, grim joke of being the most feared men in the richest city on earth, who couldn't read the street signs. Their commander was a Greek, of course, Kentarkos, but their real leader was a grizzled giant from Iceland named Thorvaldur, who had served 20 years. He taught Haraldur the unwritten rules. Rule 1. Never get involved in Greek arguments. You won't understand them and you'll end up axing the wrong man. Rule 2. Your pay comes from the emperor's privy purse. If anyone else, even a purple-born prince, tries to pay or command you, ignore them. It's a trap. Rule 3. The wine here is sweet and strong. It will sneak up on you and make you do stupid things. See Rule 1. The boredom was punctuated by moments of surreal violence. Haraldur's first action wasn't on a battlefield, but in a palace corridor. A courtier, a patricios, had been caught in some labyrinthine plot. The order came not for a trial, but for execution. The Kentarkos pointed at Haraldur and another new man. You, him, the marble courtyard. Now, they dragged the screaming, silk-clad man out. He was babbling offers, promises, naming powerful names. Haraldur didn't understand a word. In the courtyard, they forced him to his knees. The other Varangian, a Dane, held him. Haraldur raised his axe. It wasn't war. It wasn't combat. It was butchery. But it was the job. The axe fell. The sound was wet and final. A slave appeared instantly with a bucket of sand to soak up the blood. 10 minutes later, A different courtier walked across the same spot, delicately stepping around the damp patch, not breaking his conversation. Heraldry learned a lesson more valuable than gold. In Constantinople, death was not an event. It was a cleaning problem. But there was also the other side of the coin, the wealth. When the emperor was pleased, he would shower them with gifts. Not just coin, but things. After a successful campaign against pirates, Heraldry received a bolt of silk so fine it felt like holding smoke. He traded it to a Venetian merchant for a weight in silver that would have been a king's ransom back north. He sent most of it home to his nephew Magnus to buy support. This was the true lure of the Guard. It was a funnel, sucking the ancient wealth of the Mediterranean northward, one axe swing at a time. A Varangian's retirement plan was to go home, buy land, and be a lord. They weren't just bodyguards. They were one-man economic development programs for Scandinavia. Heraldry saw the poison, too. He saw the emperor, a man who had been a burly sailor before his brother elevated him, grow thin and pale. He coughed blood into a golden cloth. The Greeks whispered of a slow poison, administered by a rival faction. The Varangians tightened the ring around him. They tasted everything. Heraldry spent a month eating nothing but a portion of the emperor's meals before they were served, waiting for the twinge in his gut that would signal treason. It never came. The emperor just wasted away, a man being murdered by a shadow his axemen couldn't touch. When Michael IV finally died, the Guard's oath was fulfilled. They stood down. They did not mourn. They packed their gear and waited for the next emperor to buy their loyalty with a larger donative. The man was dead. The throne remained, and the throne paid. This was Heraldry's education. It was here, in the heart of the ancient world, that this Norse prince learned the cynical calculus of real power. He saw that loyalty was a currency, that fear was more useful than love, that the greatest empires were sustained not by heroes, but by systems, and by men willing to be brutal, simple cogs in those systems. He stored it all away, the tactics, the politics, the sheer scale of ambition. When he finally left Constantinople years later, richer than a god, he didn't just take a chest of gold. He took a blueprint for how to rule. He would take it back to the fjords, and with it, he would try to build a kingdom of his own. And he would fail because some lessons can only be applied in the place they are learned. You cannot build Byzantium in the snow. But that is a story for later. For now, Heraldry stands his watch, a giant in a land of schemers, learning that sometimes the most powerful law is not written down. It's the law of the axe. Simple, direct, and forever waiting just behind the throne. While Heraldry learned the brutal rhythms of palace life, another kind of madness was fermenting in the sun-baked ports of the Levant. We left the Crusader states in their twilight of corruption. But corruption has a life of its own. It doesn't just rot. It breeds strange, new creatures. In the shadow of the falling cross, a different kind of knight was being forged. Not in the smithy of faith or chivalry, but in the counting house of necessity. His name was Reynold. Reynold of Châtillon wasn't a king. He was a second son, landless, driven by a hunger that made the Holy Land's usual greed look like pious restraint. He arrived with the Second Crusade, a knight of middling rank, and saw not a sacred battleground, but a frontier. A lawless, glorious, terrifying frontier where a man with enough nerve could carve out a kingdom from the chaos. And Reynold had nerve to spare. He married a princess, Constance of Antioch, by sheer audacity and became a prince. But a title was just a tool. Reynold wanted wealth, the kind of wealth that could buy armies and make kings blink. He looked at the maps, not the scripture. His new principality, Antioch, sat astride the great trade routes. Caravans from Damascus laden with spices, silk, and slaves. Ships from Egypt carrying gold and grain. And all of it passed by his doorstep, paying tariffs to Muslim emirs or rival Christian barons. Reynold saw a shortcut. He wouldn't tax the trade. He would become the trade. By force. He became a pirate prince. He didn't just raid the occasional caravan. He launched a fleet into the Red Sea, a body of water the Crusaders had never touched. He captured ships, not for their cargo, but for their potential. His plan was as insane as it was breathtaking. To sail down the coast of Arabia, sack the holy cities of Medina and Mecca, and strangle the economic and spiritual heart of Islam. It was a move of such profound, world-altering ambition that it made the Pope's calls for Jerusalem seem parochial. He wasn't fighting for the Holy Sepulchre. He was aiming to decapitate the rival faith and seize its treasure in one stroke. He failed, of course. His rampage was stopped by the Egyptian fleet. He was captured and spent 16 years in a Muslim dungeon in Aleppo. But those years didn't break him. They baked his ambitions into a permanent, hardened shape. When he was finally ransomed, he was given the lordship of Kerak, a monstrous castle that loomed over the vital caravan route from Damascus to Egypt. Reynold had learned his lesson. No more grand naval expeditions, just simple, ruthless banditry. Kerak became the engine of his greed. From its heights, his men would swoop down on the rich caravans that snaked through the valley below. He didn't care about truces. A truce was for kings and diplomats, for men who worried about realms and reputations. Reynold was beyond that. He was a force of nature, a businessman whose product was terror and whose ledger was written in blood and plunder. When Saladin, the rising sultan of Egypt and Syria, agreed to a fragile 4-year truce with the king of Jerusalem, Reynold saw not peace, but an opportunity. With his rivals lulled, the caravans would be fatter, less guarded. He struck. He captured a colossal caravan, one said to be carrying the sister of Saladin himself. The wealth was unimaginable. The insult was unforgivable. In breaking the truce, Reynold wasn't just committing an act of war. He was violating the fundamental medieval code, even among enemies. He was proving that, for some men, the only law was appetite. Saladin, a man who valued honor and protocol, swore upon Allah that he would kill Reynold with his own hand. The other Crusader barons were horrified. Reynold had just lit a fuse on a powder keg they were all sitting on. They begged him to return the plunder and the prisoners. He laughed. He was in Kerak, impregnable, rich, and utterly beyond their control. He was the ultimate conclusion of the Crusader experiment. Holy war stripped of every holy pretense, reduced to pure, avaricious piracy. Reynold's story shows us the final evolution of the knightly ideal in the East. He wasn't a secret poisoner, he was a public cancer. The hypocrisy of the earlier Crusaders, praying in the morning, sinning by night, was a form of cognitive dissonance. Reynold had no such dissonance. He had integrated the contradiction. For him, the cross on his surcoat wasn't a symbol of faith. It was a brand, a license to steal. He had taken the hidden greed that corrupted the Holy Land and made it his open, operating principle. His actions directly led to the disaster at the Springs of Hattin in 1187. Saladin, enraged and legally justified in the eyes of God and man, lured the dehydrated, exhausted Crusader army onto a waterless plateau and annihilated it. King Guy of Jerusalem was captured. The true cross was lost, and Reynold was brought before Saladin's tent. Saladin offered the king a cup of iced rosewater, a sign of mercy. Guy drank, then passed the cup to Reynold. Fatal mistake. By Islamic custom, giving a prisoner refreshment guaranteed his safety. Saladin flew into a rage. "I did not give him the drink," he thundered. He then offered Reynold a choice: convert to Islam and live. Reynold, for all his sins, refused. Perhaps there was a shard of the old fanaticism left. Perhaps it was just pride. Saladin drew his scimitar and struck him down, fulfilling his oath. Then, in a chilling act of chivalric respect for his actual foe, he assured the terrified King Guy, "You are safe. Kings do not kill kings." Reynold died as he lived. A loophole, an exception, a man who operated in the spaces between laws, codes, and faiths until the rules finally snapped shut on his neck. He was the dark avatar of the Crusader dream, proving that when you go to a holy land seeking fortune, you might just find a monster in the mirror, holding an axe and a balance sheet. Let us now turn from the grand stage of princes and pirates to a smaller, darker room. While Reynold shattered truces and heralders stood his watch, the true artisans of the medieval shadow world were engaged in a quieter, more meticulous craft. We've spoken of poison in the abstract as a tool of power. But every tool has a master, and every master has a story. Our story now belongs not to a queen or a cardinal, but to a woman in a small Italian city-state in the 14th century. Her name was Julia, and she was, for a time, the most sought-after pharmacist in Siena. Her shop was a place of calm. Sunlight streamed through a high window, illuminating dancing dust motes above shelves of beautiful, simple ceramic jars. They were labeled not with skulls, but with elegant script: rosmarinus, salvia, mentha. She was known for her remedies: a salve for burns that healed without infection, a tea for sleeplessness that brought dreamless rest, a tonic for melancholy that could lift the spirit. Noble women confided in her. Merchants trusted her. The church, seeing her piety and skill, left her in peace. She was a respected member of the guild, a widow who had taken over her husband's practice and improved upon it. But Julia had a second set of books, not ledgers of debt, but of dosage. In a locked chest beneath a flagstone, she kept a different collection of jars. Their labels were not written, but etched with a single, tiny symbol known only to her and a select few clients. A jar with a symbol of a tear held a refined white powder, arsenic. One with a coiled serpent held a tincture of belladonna. Another, with a closed eye, held a sleep that could be made permanent. Julia was not a murderer. She was a specialist. She saw herself as a solver of impossible problems. Her clients came to her not with symptoms, but with situations. A husband who was cruel and whose death would free a substantial inheritance. A brother whose political ambitions threatened the family's standing. A rival in love who had become inconvenient. These were not crimes of passion, but of calculus. And Julia provided the arithmetic. Her process was clinical, devoid of malice. She would listen, her face impassive. She never judged, never offered moral counsel. She was a contractor. Then she would ask precise questions. How swift must the resolution be? Should it resemble a natural illness? Is there a physician who attends the subject, and is he competent? Based on the answers, she would consult her private codex, a handwritten book of recipes she had compiled from ancient texts, whispered conversations with Moorish traders, and her own careful, dreadful experiments on stray animals. She dealt in subtlety. A chronic dose of lead-sweetened wine could produce gout, irritability, and a slow decline, perfect for an aging, tyrannical husband, whose death would be mourned by none and investigated by fewer. A single, stronger dose of something derived from monkshood could mimic a sudden apoplexy, a strike from God. She was a playwright of death, scripting final acts that would not ring false to the audience of family and priests. Her most famous and most fraught preparation was known among her discreet clientele as Aqua della Tofana. Tofana's water, a clear, odorless, tasteless liquid, sold in small vials that looked like holy water or beauty tonic. 3 drops in soup or wine. The symptoms began days later. A vague fatigue, a loss of appetite, then vomiting, cramps, and a gentle, deepening sleep from which one did not wake. It left no marks, no telltale signs in the mouth. To the physicians of the day, it was a putrid fever or a melancholy of the humors. Julia's business thrived because she understood the law better than the lawyers. The law needed evidence, a witness, a weapon. She left none. The law dealt in public fact. She dealt in private certainty. Her clients were not alleyway thugs. They were weeping gentlewomen, grim-faced younger sons, nervous priests. They paid her not just in coin, but in silences, in protections. A well-placed word from a cardinal's niece could dismiss a troublesome inquiry from the city guard. For decades, she operated in this gray space, a ghost in the machinery of the medieval city. Her power was absolute because it was invisible. She held no lands, commanded no soldiers, but she held the keys to secrets, and in a world run on secrets, that was a throne. Her end, when it came, was not from a rival's poison or an investigator's brilliance. It was from the oldest weakness, a loose tongue. A client, a young noblewoman whose husband had succumbed to a remarkably swift fever, confessed the details to her priest in a moment of hysterical guilt. The priest, bound by the seal of confession, could not act. But the woman, unburdened, grew reckless. She bragged to a trusted maid, who told a lover, who whispered it in a tavern. Rumors solidified into accusation. The city authorities, terrified of the scandal touching its highest families, moved quietly. They did not storm her shop. They invited her for questioning on a minor guild matter. Once inside the Palazzo Pubblico, the questions changed. They presented her not with blades or hot irons, but with logic. They had names, dates, symptoms. They had the maid's testimony. They offered her a choice. Name her clients and face exile, or protect them and face the stake. Julia, the master of silent solutions, said nothing. She knew the law's final, blunt instrument, the charge of witchcraft, was her only possible conviction. To speak would doom the powerful families who could still protect her or avenge her. Silence was her last, perfect contract. She was tried not as a pharmacist, but as a witch. The evidence of her poisons was proof of a pact with the devil. The court, relieved to have a solitary, powerless head to cut off, convicted her. On the day of her execution, the square was packed, but the prominent faces were absent. The noblewomen watched from shuttered windows. The merchants looked away. Julia Tofana, who had held life and death in her measured drops, was burned alone, a scapegoat for 100 unspoken sins. Her codex was burned with her. Her poisons, however, lived on. Recipes for Tofana's water circulated in the criminal underworld for a century. She had perfected a service, and the market for it endured. Her story completes the picture of the medieval poisoner, not as a cartoon villain, but as a professional, a mirror to the Varangian Guard. Where the Varangians were the brute, public instrument of the emperor's will, she was the delicate, private instrument of a dozen private wills. They enforced the law of the throne. She nullified the laws of God and man for a price. In the end, both were tools. And tools, when they become too dangerous or too known, are always discarded. We have seen the professional, the guarded emperor, the piratical prince, the clinical poisoner. But the medieval world was vast, and its laws, born from singular madness, touched the lives of the obscure as surely as the powerful. For every Reynold carving a kingdom, there were 1,000 souls navigating a forest of bizarre, hyperspecific rules that could ruin them for a moment of weakness, a bad joke, or simply being in the wrong place when a nobleman's fish got the hiccups. Let us zoom in, then, on a place and a person far from the centers of power. A small market town in the Rhineland, circa 1350. The Black Death has receded, leaving ghosts and empty spaces. Our person is a woman named Greta. She is a widow. Her husband, a cobbler, died not of plague, but from a falling timber while repairing the Lord's mill. With no son to inherit the trade, Greta is clinging to the edges of the economy. She keeps 2 goats, tends a small vegetable patch, and, most importantly, she bakes. Not in an oven of her own, but in the town's communal oven, after the licensed bakers have finished their regulated loaves. She makes kuchen, simple, flat cakes sweetened with precious honey or dried berries. They are a small luxury sold to neighbors for a penny. It is a fragile existence, a hair's breadth from destitution, and it is about to be shattered by a law she has never heard of. The trouble begins with a festival. The town is celebrating the feast of its patron saint. There is ale, and there is laughter, and there is a traveling performer, a juggler with a trained dog. Greta, feeling a rare moment of lightness, buys a cup of ale. Later, back at her hovel, she gives the dregs, thick with yeast sediment, to her goats. They bleat happily. One of them, the younger, frisky one, seems particularly energized, prances in its pen. The next day, the goat is listless. It lies down, its sides heaving. Greta is worried. The local cowherd, passing by, peers over the fence. Looks drunk, he chucks, smelling the fermented ale on the goat's breath. He means it as a joke, but a boy hears it. The boy tells his mother, who tells the bailiff's wife, who mentions it to the bailiff himself as a bit of town gossip. The bailiff is a man named Herr Schmidt. He is petty, insecure, and fiercely protective of his minor authority. He also has a problem. The town's lord, a minor knight obsessed with status, has recently returned from a tournament where he heard a hilarious, cautionary tale about a nobleman in England and his drunken fish. The lord had then issued a stern, rambling decree to his bailiffs. The wanton waste of good ale and the scandalous inebriation of livestock would not be tolerated on his lands. It was an unenforceable joke of a law, meant to make the lord sound wise and in command. But to Herr Schmidt it is an order. He sees in Greta's ailing goat not a sick animal, but an opportunity. An opportunity to demonstrate his vigilance, to please his lord, and to exert his power over a defenseless woman. He marches to Greta's cottage with 2 town guards. "Widow Greta," he intones, "you are charged with the willful inebriation of a beast, a violation of the Lord's ordinance and a disturbance of the natural order." Greta is dumbfounded. She tries to explain. It was just the dregs, a scrap. The goat is sick, perhaps with bloat. Herr Schmidt cuts her off. The evidence is clear. The cowherd is summoned and, under the bailiff's stern gaze, confirms the goat smelled of drink. The goat itself, now clearly ill with something unrelated, is presented as the stupefied victim. There is no trial. Not really. Greta is brought before the village headman and the priest. The bailiff presents his case. The headman, fearing the Lord's displeasure, nods along. The priest, uneasy, mutters about the sin of waste. Greta is fined. The fine is everything she has. The pennies from her last week's kuchen, a silver brooch that was her mother's. She is also sentenced to stand in the stocks for half a day, with a sign that reads, in crude pictures, "Waster of ale." The punishment is not about justice. It is about theater. It is about reinforcing the hierarchy. The Lord, via his bailiff, has demonstrated that even the most obscure of his Lord's whims is law, even down to the digestion of goats. The townspeople gather, not with anger, but with a kind of morbid curiosity. They gawk at Greta, humiliated, her head and hands locked in wood. Some pity her, some sneer. Most simply absorb the lesson. The law is a net so fine it can catch anyone, for anything. Do not draw attention. Do not step out of line. Do not even let your goat seem too happy. Greta's goat dies 2 days later, probably from eating a poisonous weed. She buries it behind her cottage. The incident is over. Herr Schmidt reports his decisive action to the Lord, who laughs and forgets about it by dinner. But for Greta, the world has changed. The fragile trust that allows a poor woman to trade in a market is broken. People are wary. Her kuchen sales dwindle. The shame clings to her like a smell. She becomes a footnote, a casualty of a legal system so obsessed with control that it will devour its own to prove it can. This is the true, grinding weight of the medieval world. Not the grand battles or the papal intrigues, but the countless, tiny tyrannies enacted by small men with a little authority and a deep-seated fear of chaos. The law of drunken fish wasn't a funny story in Greta's world. It was a weapon, and it was aimed, as such weapons always are, at the easiest target. While the Heralders and Reynolds and Julias played for kingdoms and fortunes, the Gretas of the world were simply trying to survive the fallout. Their stories remind us that for every law born from one insane incident at the top, there were 100 small, silent tragedies at the bottom. The architecture of power is always held up by the crushed bones of the obscure. The medieval world was a symphony of echoes. An incident in a French pigsty reverberated in a German goat pen. A nobleman's jest about armored poultry became a statute in Bohemia. But sometimes, the echo didn't just repeat. It distorted, amplified, and came back as something entirely new. The obsession with controlling the unpredictable, be it animals, objects, or human folly, eventually turned inward, towards the most unpredictable element of all, belief itself. This is how we arrive at one of the most peculiar and telling episodes. The law born not from a drunken knight or a runaway belle, but from a suspiciously intelligent dog. The year is 1494, in the Alpine region of Tyrol. A peasant farmer named Albrecht brings a complaint before the local magistrate. His neighbor, a reclusive woodcarver named Thomas, owns a dog, a large, shaggy, sharp-eyed breed used for guarding flocks. This dog, Albrecht claims, is not natural. It understands too much. It follows complex commands without a word being spoken, just a gesture. It once herded Albrecht's straying sheep back into their pen without being told. Most damningly, during a violent thunderstorm, Albrecht swears he saw the dog standing on its hind legs at the window of Tomas's workshop, watching the lightning as if reading God's anger in the sky. In a different era, this might be chalked up to a clever animal and a superstitious man. But this is the late 15th century. The witch panic is beginning to boil. The Church's war on heresy has sensitized everyone to the uncanny. The line between a gifted animal and a demonic familiar is perilously thin. The magistrate, a practical man, dismisses Albrecht, but the rumor takes root. It feeds on older fears. Tomas is a woodcarver, an artisan who transforms dead wood into living saints and grotesque gargoyles. He works with his hands, but also with his imagination, a suspicious trait. He lives alone but for the dog. He is quiet, the perfect canvas upon which a fearful community can paint its dread. The incident that triggers the law occurs during the spring plowing festival. There are games, races, and a contest for the best trained animal. Tomas, urged by a few daring friends, enters his dog. The dog performs marvels. It fetches specific named objects from a pile. It solves a simple puzzle to open a gate. It even appears to count by barking a specific number of times. The crowd is first amazed, then uneasy. Their laughter grows forced. When the dog wins a small purse of coins, which it carries delicately to Tomas in its mouth, the mood sours. This is not entertainment. It is unnerving. It feels like a parody of human reason. A Dominican friar, visiting from a nearby monastery to bless the fields, witnesses the display. He sees not intelligence, but possession. A beast performing acts that require a rational soul, which animals do not possess. Therefore, the logic proceeds, the rationality must come from elsewhere. From a demon. And who commands the demon? The quiet woodcarver. The friar raises the alarm. Tomas is detained for questioning, not by secular authorities, but by the Church. The dog is impounded. An inquisitorial process, small-scale but deadly serious, begins. They are not investigating a crime of action, but a crime of nature. The charge is not witchcraft yet, but the cultivation of unnatural faculties in a brute creature, suggestive of heretical praxis. Tomas's defense, that he had simply spent years patiently training the dog with kindness and consistency, is seen as further proof of an unholy patience, a diabolical bond. The dog, in its cage, behaves like a well-trained, confused dog. Its intelligence is now read as malevolent cunning. Before the process can go further, and likely end at the stake, the local secular lord intervenes. Baron von Eck. He is a cynical, weary man who has seen enough burnings. He also knows Tomas carves the beautiful altarpiece angels for his private chapel. He has no love for the overreaching Dominican. He wants the problem to go away, not ignite a witch hunt that could disrupt his lands. Baron von Eck convenes his council. They devise a solution that is pure medieval bureaucracy. They don't rule on whether the dog is demonic. They create a law that makes the situation illegal. The decree, posted on the church door, states, "Henceforth, no person shall train or harbor any beast to mimic the rational acts of man, such as counting, feigning comprehension of complex speech, or performing tricks that ape human industry, lest such imitation breed confusion among the simple and suspicion of infernal influence." The law against too clever dogs. Tomas is released with a warning. The dog is confiscated and, it is quietly said, taken to the baron's own kennels. The friar, thwarted, departs in a rage. The town is pacified, its fears given the concrete shape of a law. Order is restored. But the law does something more profound. It criminalizes a perception. It does not outlaw demonic pacts. It outlaws the appearance of them. It legislates against the uncanny valley of the medieval mind. The problem wasn't the dog's intelligence. It was the community's inability to process it within their rigid worldview. Since they could not expand their worldview, they contracted the world to fit it. They made the extraordinary illegal. This incident is the mirror image of the pig trial. The pig was tried for acting like a vicious human. The dog was outlawed for acting like an intelligent human. One was punished for crossing a moral boundary. The other was preemptively forbidden from crossing a cognitive boundary. Both laws were fences built around the definition of what it meant to be human in a world terrified of blurred lines. It shows the final, paranoid stage of the medieval quest for order. Having tried to legislate behavior, then secrets, they now tried to legislate the very appearance of mystery. It was a losing battle. The world was too strange, too full of clever dogs and flying monks and talented poisoners. You couldn't pass enough laws to make it all make sense. But by God, they kept trying. Right up to the end, they kept writing decrees, building a paper fortress against a reality that was always, inevitably, smarter, stranger, and more ungovernable than any law could ever be. We have traversed the spectrum of medieval madness, from the barnyard to the throne room, from the absurd to the apocalyptic. But to truly close this long chronicle, we must return to where we began, with the law. Not a specific, ridiculous law, but with the idea of law itself in the medieval mind. For in their frantic, often foolish legislation, they were grappling with a problem we have never solved. How do you build a cage for chaos when you are made of the same wild stuff? Let us consider the final, great, insane incident of the Middle Ages. It was not a single event, but a slow, collective realization that dawned over centuries. The incident was the plague. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 wasn't just a demographic catastrophe. It was a theological and legal crisis of the highest order. All their laws, divine and human, had failed. The codes of chivalry didn't stop it. The canons of the church didn't stop it. The intricate feudal contracts meant nothing to a bacterium. The plague was the ultimate chaos, a runaway bell that crushed not just a fruit cart, but civilization itself. And how did they respond? With more laws, of course. But these were laws of a different, darker flavor. Quarantine laws born in the Italian city-states that walled off the sick and the healthy. Laws fixing wages when laborers became scarce, trying to chain an economy that was bucking like a wild horse. Laws blaming and persecuting Jews, lepers, strangers, anyone who could be cast as the source of the disorder, a human pig to put on trial for the crime of existence. The plague laws were their most desperate, their most brutal, and in a terrible way, their most honest. They revealed that when truly faced with an incomprehensible universe, the medieval response was not to question their framework, but to reinforce it with violence and fear. This is the ultimate legacy of the medieval legal mind, a profound, institutionalized terror of the random. Every law we've examined is a scar from that terror. The pig trial was a scar from the terror of moral randomness. The poisoned cup was a scar from the terror of political randomness. The ban on flying monks was a scar from the terror of intellectual randomness. They could not abide the idea that a child could die for no reason, that a king could fall from a bad oyster, that a man could fly without angels' wings. So they invented reasons. They constructed systems of cause and effect where none existed. They built a world of signifiers where everything meant something, because a world where things just happened was too terrifying to inhabit. We are their children. We inherited not just their institutions, but their existential anxiety. We no longer blame witches for crop failure, usually, but we have our own pantheon of causal villains. Ideologies, viruses, economic theories, hidden conspiracies. We still crave the narrative. We still pass reactive, specific laws after every new insane incident. A new financial instrument collapses. A new technology disrupts society. A new style of violence horrifies us. Our laws are more sophisticated, our understanding of cause and effect vastly improved, but the impulse is the same. To slam the stable door, to reassert control, to prove that we are the authors of this story and not just its bewildered characters. So, what is the final verdict on this 1,000-year experiment in order-making? It was a magnificent failure. They failed to create a stable Christian empire. It fragmented into nations. They failed to maintain chivalric purity. It rotted into mercenary cynicism. They failed to legislate holiness. They got the Inquisition. They failed to keep the chaos out. But in failing, they built the workshop where the modern world was forged. Their failures were our textbooks. The failure of divine right made us think about secular contracts. The failure of church authority made room for science. The failure of feudal loyalty gave rise to the concept of the nation-state. The dizzying, contradictory, oppressive, and creative energy of the Middle Ages was the labor pains of something new. We stand now in a world they could not have imagined, yet one they built piece by piece, law by law, sin by sin. We are still building our cages for chaos. Our cages are made of data and algorithms, of international treaties and economic policies. They are more complex, more global, but the beast inside is the same, and it is still us. The story of the Middle Ages is not a history of a time. It is the history of a human mood, a long, dark, glittering, furious, and deeply creative mood in which we tried to convince ourselves that we were in charge. The joke, the tragedy, and the glory is that we are still trying. The last insane incident is always the next one, and the next law is always being written. Thank you for walking this long road. Remember the pig. Remember the poison. Remember the axe, the cross, and the falling bell. But most of all, remember the lawmaker, hunched over his parchment in a dim room, trying to fix a broken world with words, forever afraid of the silence, and the laughter just outside his door.